All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I believe this is episode 49 we are on. Almost on episode 50. That's an accomplishment. That's a landmark. We are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. And we are at the bottom of page 115 on chapter 5. So let's continue reading. Give me 1 second. All right. Quote, "Oh, look at the police," end quote. The resonance of subservience, separation, and generativity. In chapter 3, I show that the three main frames for state-society relations, subservience, separation, and generativity, all shape how the police approach the citizenry. In many instances, the police demonstrate an acute desire to respond effectively to citizens' requests. However, they often reinforce a self-construction as an aloof and authoritative force. And, in all instances, they act upon an implicit sense of what, quote, community, end quote, is, and act through a set of bureaucratic routines. So, even if these three means of constructing the state-society relation are in frequent tensions with one another, each is still potent in structuring police relations with the communities they serve. Similarly, all three state-society paradigms influence how the citizenry understand the police. The interviews revealed acceptance of the legitimacy of each. Subservience. Not surprisingly, citizens commonly endorse the idea that the police should be subservient to the public. Residents most frequently made this plain when discussing their requests for police service. When residents call the police, they expect to be understood and to receive an indication of how the police will respond. The interviewees regularly stated a need for the police to be more available and responsive. This emerged typically as our respondents described the absence of a desired police response. Residents were dismayed that requests for service generated no visits from officers, that phone calls to community police officers were not returned. They were often frustrated that 911 operators did not understand what they wished to report, that patrol officers were slow to show up or never arrived at all. They expressed frequent dissatisfaction with the police force that seemed incapable of making explicit what the public could expect from a call for service. So, the public expects a subservient police force primarily through faster and more thorough responsiveness. But for many, a desire for something more was evident. They hoped for a deeper sense of connection to the police than they regularly experienced. Part of this seemed to be a nostalgia for a perhaps imagined past when the officer on the block was a familiar and central figure in community life. But, more typically, the justification for a closer connection was to improve the flow of communication. In this way, many respondents suggested the police could be more responsive to the community's input. Terry, a Centralia resident, was asked what would make his neighborhood more of a community. Terry: "Well, I think if we had 5 or 6 police officers like this walking in the street, like getting to know the neighbors, their names, kind of like the people that are most troublemakers, like neighbors. You know, the neighbors that are the most troublemakers, stuff like interviewer, that would help make it more of a community then?" Terry: "Yeah, so it would be like safer and people wouldn't be so much scared of the police anymore. Because some of the people, they would be like, quote, 'Oh, look at the police,' end quote." Another resident, Mark, expounded on the same theme in his desire for not just more officers, but more approachable officers. Quote, "I've heard it said that I wish there would be a patrol car moving up and down the street. But I think that patrolmen could get out of that car and actually walk the neighborhood. I think they would be able to be a little bit closer to the community," end quote. This closeness, he later elaborated, would help the police understand more completely the resources. This closeness, he later elaborated, would help the police understand more completely the sources of residents' concern. Officers would then be better positioned to respond well to citizen requests. Some focus specifically on teenagers. They theorize that teenagers often know a lot about existing and impending criminal activity. If the police could establish better ties to teenagers, they would acquire more data about where crime might emerge and could plan accordingly. Richard from Westside explained this point well. Richard: and you know what would be a real plus? If the police department would be a little bit more friendly towards some of the kids around here. Not all of them, but I think a lot of them are put in the same basket. The bad and the good are all mixed together. And I think that they assume that all kids are bad, or are going to be, or doing something suspicious or something awful. And a lot of them aren't. But if they actually could take a couple extra seconds and stop and talk to some of these kids, at least some of the older ones, it would be a real plus. And it would be great for PR, and it would pick up a ton of information. Overall, it was striking that residents so regularly evince the desire to know the police on more informal terms, to establish a chattier relation to a regular patrol cop. Because many of them believe that a more informal relationship with the police would increase their access, they endorse the closer tie to promote greater responsiveness and effectiveness. By contrast, however, none suggested a need for the public to oversee the work of the police in any meaningful fashion. There were no endorsements for a police review board or any other formalized means by which the public could evaluate officers. Rare was the interviewee who expressed no interest in police reform of some sort. More commonly, there were numerous suggestions for how things could change. About how things could change about the police approaching the citizenry. In many instances, the police demonstrate an acute desire to respond effectively. Oh, all right. My fault, y'all. I fucked that all the way up. Trying to turn these pages be a pain in the fucking ass. All right, let me reread that sentence. Rare was the interviewee who expressed no interest in police reform of some sort. More commonly, there were numerous suggestions for how things could change, about which more below. I don't know how he was phrasing that sentence. I don't know. But even those who were most frustrated never advocated formal mechanisms for citizen oversight of the police. Granted, a few respondents complained about excessive use of police force. More such residents in the sample might have revealed greater interest in an institution such as the Citizen Review Board. Even so, during the research period, Seattle Police Department officers shot and killed 3 citizens in circumstances sufficiently cloudy that activist groups complained bitterly about police brutality and used local media to press for citizen oversight. In such a historical moment, it is striking that none of those interviews seemed persuaded that a move toward formalized citizen oversight was necessary. In short, the oft-stated desire for more and more responsive police officers illustrated the profound resonance of the narrative of subservience. Citizens wish to relate well enough with the police to influence what officers do, and they expect a response to a call for assistance. And many of them desire a connection of some familiarity and casual conversation to enable a flow of information that can equip the police to solve the problems about which residents complain. But even if many wish this informal connection, many simultaneously recognize that the police must, at times, maintain their distance. In other words, they recognize the legitimacy of police efforts to position themselves as separate from the public. This push toward separation has 2 sources, both of which were recognized by the citizenry. They saw that the police must obey the dictates of the law, even in the face of public demand. They also sometimes applauded officers who maintained an air of professional authority. And that brings us to the end of that passage that was on subservience. And I think one of the things that stands out to me is, first, I think that just like has been a regular theme in the passages that we've read in this book, depending on what kind of community you're from, depending on what type of neighborhood you are in, a lot of that has a very great deal with molding and shaping not only your view of the police department and the institution of policing, but also which things should be changed and altered about policing. And so the people who are talking about wanting more police on the street and wanting the police officers to be walking the street and talking to kids and talking to people more often, these are people who feel that the police are on their side, who feel that the police are there to help them, who are there to assist them. These are people who have not been on the receiving end of the negatives of the institution of policing. And so they're trying to so they view police as like neighbors. They view police like they're their neighbors. They don't view police as a threat. They don't believe that the police are going to, they talked about in here that 3 people have been killed by the police while they were conducting these interviews and doing this research, and that nobody, even in the midst of these 3 people being killed, the people that they interviewed weren't asking for a citizens oversight review board of the police. And that's because these people don't imagine themselves or can't see themselves being in a position to be killed by the police, as opposed to people who are in neighborhoods or in communities where the right to remain silent is something that they exercise regularly, that they've been taught from an early age to exercise. I think one of the other things that's important to point out is one of their reasonings for wanting the police to talk to kids more was to get more information. And that is something that I've seen personally echoed in police community meetings, where they talk about one of their incentives for ingratiating themselves with kids is to know the kids' friends, and so the kids can tell them when certain crimes happen and certain things take place. And that's, again, when you just isolate these events or experiences to just one moment in time, maybe somebody can make the argument of why it's good for these kids to give information to the police. But what you have to extrapolate is what happens to this kid once this kid gives information to the police. These kids that are getting ingratiated with the police department, with police officers, what happens if the police one time begin to think, okay, I think this kid did this, or I think this kid committed a crime, or somebody says a crime was committed and they give the description of a kid that a cop knows, and so all of these things can get to a place where this police officer can turn this information and this relationship that he's built with this kid, that this child sees as symbiotic, into a parasitic one for him to make arrest or for him to solve an investigation, never minding what type of damage that may do to this kid in the community he's from or in the neighborhood that he's from. And again, I think that specifically with children of color, generally with children of color, but specifically with black children, it is dangerous to not properly inform them about the dangers that police officers, not only institutionally but also individually, pose to them. That police are, it is that we here in Rockford, Illinois, I've seen regularly people taking pictures with their children, with black kids with police officers, and we live in a city where on average 2 times a year there is deadly force used by the law enforcement agencies in this area, in this county, and it is disproportionately used against black kids and against black people and against people of color. And so you do a disservice when you indoctrinate these kids to thinking that police officers are the Avengers or some superheroes that are here to keep them safe at all costs. No, police officers' primary objective is making arrests, and they don't all. And those arrests are not contingent on somebody being guilty. You're supposed to be innocent until you're proven guilty. So technically, every arrest that a police officer makes is of an innocent person. And so I just think that, and again, a lot of information around policing has been propagandized, and until we get to a place of destroying that propagandization of information around policing, we will continue to have people who don't know that that every city should have a citizens review board that has subpoena power over the police and that has power to give punishment or give some type of accountability to officers. And so here, let's move on to the next segment. Separation. As much as residents might wish a police force that served at their as much as residents might wish a police force that served at their beck and call, they recognize that officers at times need to separate themselves from the citizenry and its demands. For some, this police effort at distinction was understood precisely in the terms of classic liberal thought, as a need for officers of the state to remain loyal to a more abstract legal code. Such loyalty means that state agents avoid allowing the parochial agendas of one social group to override the rights of more marginalized groups. In this way, the ideal of equality is ostensibly served. In following the law in like fashion across the social landscape, the police should treat all the same. Residents demonstrated an acceptance of this legally mandated separation between the police and the citizenry in two ways. Some expressed a deep empathy for the bind created for officers by the tension between subservience and separation. Meg, an African-American in Centralia, captured this well when discussing how many of her neighbors hold the police in contempt. Meg: I don't know that any of us out here should be involved in dealing with the police if you have no knowledge of what a police does, what his job is, what is expected of the police. If the police doesn't follow through with their job, there's a process for that. You know what I mean? But to sit up and kowtow and all that kind of stuff and always on the police's back, I'm just not like that. I give everybody the benefit of the doubt. If you're a police officer and you screw up, I'm going to tell you, you're a screw up. I'm not going to go out here beating the drum and generalize, quote, to the police, end quote. Because that's not fair to the ones that's out here that's totally dedicated, totally doing their job and trying to be officer friendly. Some of these people, they experience terrible lives because they're police officers. It's not easy on them. That's not an easy job. You're a police officer and you have to stop and think of the boundaries of the law and dealing with this chaos situation you are dealing with at the same time. They have to think twice as fast as the rest of us. Meg's degree of empathy for the police is unusual for her neighborhood. She recognizes that adherence to legal procedures can often challenge officers dealing with the demanding public in often chaotic situations. Note that the law is relevant because of the, quote, boundaries, end quote, it places around permissible police behavior. Such boundaries codify the separation between the police and the public. The recognition that adherence to the law limited police action was most readily expressed by those active in crime reduction efforts. Such activity necessarily placed citizens in closer contact with the police. They were thus more likely to be told how enforcement strategies cannot ignore legal proscriptions. Recall, for instance, the wooded area of a park reputed to host anonymous sexual encounters. This phenomenon was repeatedly raised at community meetings. Each time the community police officer reviewed how making arrests required a level of evidence his surveillance tactics were unlikely to yield. The law limited his ability to meet citizen demand. Those who conversed more regularly with the police learned of other instances where this was true, and thus generally expressed greater acceptance of how separation often trumps subservience. For instance, Nora, an Eastside resident, had attended the Citizens Academy established by the police department. This 6-week program schools citizens on key issues of police practice and procedure. Nora explained why she found the program helpful. Nora: I think that it helped me to understand that it is an incredibly challenging thing to do and really difficult, and that it requires a lot of patience from the individuals, the police officers themselves, and that is just a really challenging thing to do because you are kind of between a rock and a hard place with the demands of the community or an angry citizen who is in your face, and knowing that you have to follow the letter of the law, whether or not you think it's best. Residents also expressed acceptance of legally created separation by endorsing the ideal of equal treatment that such separation is meant to accomplish. Most commonly, this emerged as residents complained about their perception that their neighborhoods were slighted. Many believe that the political clout of more affluent neighborhoods translated into higher levels of police service. Their indignation at this perceived reality revealed their belief that equal treatment under the law demanded greater observance, that some communities' ability to make the police subservient limited the fairness that separation ostensibly promoted. Many residents also recognized that the police's internal drive toward separation, one based on adherence to their professional norms, was legitimate. Many openly accepted the argument that the police were justified, at least occasionally, in exuding an air of authority. Recall that officers endorsed this practice to assert control over potentially chaotic and dangerous situations. Some of those interviewed accepted the police's justification for this practice. Said Geraldine, a Bluff-Top resident who was interviewed jointly with a neighbor, "I think that they have that element, like playing poker. They have the ace, they have the better hand. They have to make their showing that they're not just a pushover because they are there to keep the law and order of the land, and they would say, quote, that's what we're here to do," end quote. At this point, her co-interviewee, Ashley, chimed in, quote, "That's what we paid them to do," end quote. For these two women, as for others, police displays of authoritative separation were functionally necessary to enforce the law and maintain order. Another respondent, Roland, recognized police displays of stern authority as something of a self-protective mechanism. As he put it, "But like I said, they deal with society's bullshit all the time. They see wife beaters and child killers and rapists, and they deal with the bullshit. So you've got to put on an authoritarian attitude, because if you're just the same person you're at every day, you're going to get changed." In these ways, many of those interviewed expressed an implicit acceptance of the narrative of separation between state and society. They recognized that adherence to the law meant that the police could not always comply with public demands, and that the maintenance of authority helped officers succeed and survive. As is elaborated below, however, the extent to which police officers embrace this narrative of separation frequently frustrates citizens. So, even if residents recognize the legitimacy of separation, they question how it can inhibit police acquiescence to citizens' requests. A similar ambiguity is attached to generativity. Okay, I think one of the things, and then that ends that segment, and then the next segment is generativity, and we got time to knock out that next segment. I'm happy that I broke these episodes down like this. I think one of the things I want to point out about what we just read is the importance for the majority of people in our society think in the terms of the people that we just heard speaking of. This idea that police deal with all this bullshit and the child killers, and they see rapists and woman beaters, and that they deal with chaotic situations. That you can't, don't want to. Some people, one of the things the woman said, Meg, was she didn't want to judge all officers by her experience with one officer. And I think that because that is such, and that's the mainstream thought, because of propaganda, because of indoctrination. And I think that we have to, people who think like this, I don't think you just simply cut off conversation with these people. I don't think that you just deem them to be sheep or whatever. I think that most people who grow up in this society at a point in time thinks something of this nature. I think that the way to combat that is that we must begin to educate ourselves about the institution of policing. We must begin to educate ourselves about the policies and the procedures of policing, and not simply stopping just at policing, because that's the other part of this. All of these people are stopping at policing. To understand the institution of policing, you can't stop just at police, and you cannot begin just at police. You must also understand electoral politics. You must also understand the history of politicians. You must understand the history of your city, the demographics of your city. You must understand the judicial system and how the judicial system works, and judges, and how little money, how the public defenders and state's attorneys work, at the discretion of prosecutors, the discretion of judges, mandatory minimums, understanding the and once you understand, all of these things are needed because a police officer being called and making an arrest seems like something that is just on its face plain thing to understand. But in reality, that arrest has so many implications in it. What this person's life was like before that arrest. How many things went into this person, the experiences that this person had, and the traumas that this person had that led to them to commit the quote unquote crime that they are being arrested for. What will be the things that will happen to try to address this person not committing this quote unquote crime again. Also the victims. I've had people talk to me about their houses being broken into and items being stolen and them never being able to get those items back, them never being able to get those possessions back. And so I just think that far too often these type of people are speaking about policing in isolated incidents in an envelope. In an envelope, that's the word. I don't know if that's the right word that I'm looking for. And I think that we have to get to a place of seeing these things in totalities. So here, let's go through this next segment that we got here, and then we'll wrap this episode up. Generativity. Although they are in frequent tension, the narratives of subservience and separation both presume a strong division between the police and the citizenry, between state and society. In practice, however, the distinction is often blurred because the state fundamentally constructs the community with which it interacts. I demonstrate in Chapter 3 that this occurs in two fundamental ways in the case of the police. One involves the bureaucratic routines and other cultural practices by which the police apprehend and act upon public input. Via these routines and practices, the police determine what, quote, community, end quote, actually means in practice. Generativity also operates through the moral understandings officers develop for their work. When they couch fighting crime and protecting the vulnerable as moral crusades against an evil that demands expulsion, police officers obliterate the line between state and society. Police and community are joined as twin forces of good, united in an effort to remove the stain of criminal pollution. Many residents implicitly recognize the salience of each of these generative operations. Although the bureaucratic routines through which citizens' input was channeled often prompted complaints, there was a simultaneous recognition that such routines were unavoidable and even desirable. This was more commonly expressed by those with greater awareness of police procedure, such as those who had attended the Citizens Academy. One such resident was Lane, the activist quoted at the beginning of this chapter. She found herself regularly schooling her fellow citizens on how the police operate. At more than one meeting, she explained how complaints need to be made, how the police categorize and prioritize the input they received. She hoped that greater awareness of how the police bureaucracy apprehends complaints would enable the others to mobilize the most effective response. But even those with less understanding recognize the need for procedures to differentiate between, for example, emergency and non-emergency requests for service, or for a specialized procedure for complaints about drug activity. They implicitly accepted the reality that the police structure citizen input via prescribed routines. Many of them also mimic the police by moralistically framing officers' work as a mission to expel criminal evil. Such a framing exalts the work of the police and places it above credible citizen critique. As Marshall, the pastor, put it, I have a positive view for them because I lay in bed at night while they are risking their lives so I can lay in bed at night and sleep. And if you want to talk bad about that, then you are the biggest idiot I have ever met. They are not perfect, but hey, a guy that's going to risk his life and enjoys it so that I can have a safe community to live in, kudos to them. And usually I don't intersect right in the midst of reading a segment like this, but this guy's a fucking idiot. This Marshall guy, and it's not surprised that he's a pastor. That's a commonality is people who are pastors and part of the church are subservient to policing, not understanding that if they lived in the times that the scriptures that they are preaching about were written, the people who were the police at that time, which would be like Roman soldiers, would be throwing them in jail for their beliefs. But it's just simply not true that you're laying in bed at night while police officers are risking their lives. Specifically, let's talk about here in Rockford, Illinois. it's been in the last 30 years, 2 police officers have been killed on duty. And one of the police officers that was killed on duty, he died because he shot a man in the back that was inside of a running car. And after shooting the man in the back inside of the car, killing him, the man lost control of the car. The officer was pinned inside the car. The officer died when the car crashed. And so it's just simply not true that there is this high risk to the lives of police officers. On average in this country, 3 people a day are killed by police. Think of 3 people a day in this country are killed by police. There are not 3 police officers being killed today. Not 2 police officers being killed today. That is not a thing that is happening. And so that is, again, this is indoctrination and propaganda that has people thinking that there's a higher risk to the lives of the citizens because of police than there is a risk to lives of police because of the citizens. And so that's just a non-factual statement that was written there. And this Marshall guy's a pastor. He's a fucking idiot. Okay, let's finish this segment up. The moral standing of the police is made most evident for Marshall by the fact that officers stand to pay the ultimate sacrifice to protect the citizenry, a view officers themselves endorse. From this perspective, quote, talking bad, end quote, about the police is idiotic. Such morally upstanding public servants deserve the benefit of the doubt. Although residents were not universally quick to view the police in such sanctified terms, many did frame crime as an evil in need of expulsion, and everyone saw the police as vital to that project. Indeed, the expulsion narrative's potency revealed itself even in matters that did not directly involve the police. In the most distressed neighborhood in the study area, Centralia, community activists, along with the police, developed a hegemonic explanation for the source of the crime problem: inattentive, absentee landlords. Such landlords, the common narrative went, did not monitor their residents, most notably by rarely evicting those who caused trouble. The landlords were thereby ostensibly guilty of allowing criminal behavior to fester. This narrative is notable because activists broadened their anti-crime scope beyond the police. In fact, they largely absolved the police of ultimate responsibility for the crime problem. Yet the residents share with the police the basic framing of crime and its solution. Crime is a problem perpetuated by select, morally problematic individuals who need to be expelled by a legally empowered agent of territorial force. As with the prospect of separation, though, there were limits to how much the citizenry accepted the police generation of community. Let us turn now to how the citizenry expressed resistance to separation and generativity. And then that brings us to the end of that passage in this chapter. And I think we only got 1 chapter left after this. Yeah, we got 1 chapter left after this. So I'm going to end this episode here. I think, again, just want to urge people to listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. My belief in this is that we want to continue to read from different perspectives, read different pieces of literature, all these different things, touch on different subjects. And I believe that as we do this, it builds out a complete picture of the limitations and hindrances of the institution of policing that exists in the society. And I believe that in doing that, we'll be able to begin to formulate and create alternatives to that institution that will deal with the causes as opposed to dealing with the effects. So be sure to share this episode on whatever platform you're listening to it on, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts. Also, be sure to like us on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all those different social media platforms. We put these episodes out to give people every day an opportunity to begin or to further their struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, we outside. New episode tomorrow.